thank you very much. I love speaking after a rally. It's like the best of both worlds. You're all fired up, and we're not outside in the cold anyway. So I'm glad also that it was on Take Back the Night and on violence, because basically I think that people frequently do not see the connection between violence towards women and the lack of equality for women. There's a tremendous connection, and one that I think we not only must make, but for our lives, we must solve the lack of equality to get, in fact, into a situation where we are at least safe in our own home and in our own streets. So often in a Take Back the Night march, we sometimes think in terms of the opposition or the violence coming from a stranger that we don't know in a dark night, an alley, or parts of a campus that are unknown, etc. In reality, as you know, and those of you who have marched, I'm sure, have read an awful lot of the statistics and data, but I think it bears repeating. 85% of violent instances in which men beat women or rape women, the assailant, the victim, or the survivor knows the person. It is not a random act of violence. The commonplace is that it is a man who is trying to exert his control and authority that society has said is his right. When we are trying to ratify an amendment to the Constitution that simply places women in the Constitution and gives women equal status to men, we are sending a message to men of all ages that they don't have a right to exert their authority or control by force. In fact, they don't have a right for authority or control. We have a right to our own body and our own decisions, and we are equal to them. When I was the president of NOW, and I feel like I was the president now for 100 years, I didn't start at the national level. I started locally in the area of Pittsburgh. I was a housewife, and I don't intend to go through all the 22 years. It would take us all too long, and it would distract us. But I want to connect you with the day in and day out experience of staffing a wife battering phone hotline or rape crisis hotline. Now, some of you might work on one here. Do you work on, how many people here work on rape crisis hotlines? And give them a hand. How many work on domestic violence shelters? Not very many. How that got going, having shelters and crisis centers, was in the early days of this movement, which was the late 60s and early 70s, this wave of it. We stumbled into the issue of violence. Violence was closeted. People, women, were ashamed to say that they were victims of violence in their household or that they had been raped, and it was whispered more than it was spoken about. Our first challenge was to convince the public, but indeed the most important part of the public, our own constituency, that rape was not an act of passion or love. Rape was an act of violence and control. And it's almost silly now to say that because everybody knows it. But I can remember being furious trying to explain why this was so and being on the defensive. The people did not see it at first. But we certainly have changed people's conception of what rape is. The wife battering issue was so closeted that in my home area, Pittsburgh, as I said, I was a local chapter president, how we got started on it is that we would sit in meetings, and one thing about feminists or any organizers, you'd meet and meet, and we'd sit there trying to figure out what's the thing that we should be doing. As our consciences were awakening, it seemed like the whole world was upside down. You didn't know which piece of it to work on. And essentially, I can never forget the first woman who in a meeting in Pennsylvania took me aside and said, why doesn't anybody talk about wife beating as a problem we should be dealing with? And frankly, we didn't know anything about it. And I said, well, okay, you bring it up. And if you're interested, would you chair the meeting? One of the things about organizing is anybody who wants to do a project, the first thing you must do is make sure they lead it. You don't get a chance to suggest something idly. You act upon it. And so essentially, from that little discussion, we formed one of the first domestic violence task forces of the National Organization for Women. And frankly, at that time, we asked in a room of maybe 30, 40 women, did anybody know anything about the issue? And they didn't think it was very big, you know what I mean? They thought it was a small issue. We all did. And it must be out there, but gosh, what should we do? So we decided, Pittsburgh is the city of libraries, that we go to a library. You know, we were all oriented towards books, I guess, and so we'll look it up and see what they say and figure out what to do. Go to libraries, and there was nothing about wife beating, or there was no word called domestic violence, and that phrase didn't exist. And the only thing you could see about violence of this nature was in some psychological books there would be little subsections, and it would be under the section of sadomasochistic behavior. And the normal premise was, in those days, this is not 100 years ago, the beginning of the 70s, was that the woman was beaten because she liked it. It was a relationship that services both people's needs. Now, I'm proud to say that even then, we thought that was, you can use the word, someone said stupid, I would say something stronger. But we knew that they didn't know what they were talking about, and frankly felt that it was sick, the explanation, and serviced a small handful of people who were writing the books. And so we thought we had to get our own data, and we had to do our own studies. So we decided to put little postcards up in supermarkets asking if they were in distress or trouble, if they were to call our numbers. We didn't have hotlines. It was our home numbers. And of course, we're eager beaver types, all A students, or people who try too hard, these darn women, always trying to do 10 times as much for not anything. But anyway, we put postcards up everywhere, and I didn't think that was enough, so I thought, what the heck, there was a local talk show hostess, or anyway, female, named Marie Torrey on KDKA, which was the largest television station in Pittsburgh at the time, and we knew her, so we called her up and said, would you put us on and we could discuss the problem and see how many phone calls we get, and we'll do a study from all this to figure out what to do. So I went on KDKA with all these postcards up, and I can tell you, the only thing that I can remember after that was a bliss of nightmare phone calls. We were so flooded, we did not know what to do. We were so overwhelmed by the size of the problem that we were almost in a state of shock. I can remember being on the phone in my own kitchen, hearing screaming in the background with a woman calling saying he's going to kill me, and I'm thinking, dear God, what do I do? I'm here, I got 2 little kids, I don't know how to get out of this house myself to help her. My heavens, why did we put this up? But it's a good thing we did put it up. If we didn't put it up, for sure she would have had nobody helping her. We got to get some on and on. And so we brought the problem to the national level of now and started forming domestic violence task forces all over the country. Incidentally, we weren't the only chapters doing this. Like so many other things that happened and movements, it was happening in other parts of the country. Writers were getting interested, and as you know, a movement was launched. I never thought in those days, or knew in those days, or even imagined in those days, the size of this problem. Recently, I was in Los Angeles at the police academy. There had been in the news, and this is like a couple years ago, a case in which a woman called a 911 number. And she said, "My husband is coming to get me, to shoot me, and he has a gun." And the answer was, "When he gets there, call back." So when he got there, she had herself and 3 other female relatives, I don't remember if they were aunts or a sister or something, there. Oh, they did ask her, by the way, "How do you know he's coming with a gun?" And she said, "My brother-in-law called to warn us. He's on his way. You've got to get the police here immediately," etc. She was, the transmission records the voice in a very, very hyper, obviously hysterical or excited, I mean, obviously. Anyway, the answer was firm. When he gets there, call back. Of course, when he got there was no time to call back. He shot and killed her and the 3 women who were with her. I was just so upset and outraged. I keep thinking I can't get any more outraged, and something else happens that makes me feel that this is the one that is going to cause me to go over the bend myself. And so a group of us went down to the police academy. We were determined to get to the bottom of why in heaven's name there was such a standard reply, because we by then found out that the standard reply in LA at that time was, "When they get there, call back." We went to the police academy, and of course, we were met with a whole delegation of women. Now, I am not lost my senses. I know where I am. I know what country it is. I know the world I live in. And I know that the typical police person is a male. I know that the chief of police and all the underlings and any kind of position of command are men. But the whole delegation meeting us to talk about this problem were women. They had sent their women to cool out those women. And how many times have I had their women cool out us? And I have to think, why am I going to sit here yelling at these poor women defending an indefensible situation? So we decided to cool it. We were just going to retrieve information and not to get upset with these poor people who in fact had no power or no control. And in many ways, it was the smartest thing we could have done because they gave us so much information, and we've launched a huge integration of the police force project in Los Angeles. But one of the key figures that will lock into my brain was in the midst of this, we went through painstaking decals. What do they do when a distress call like this comes in? How's it classified? What is the standard answer, et cetera, and why? As they were explaining everything over again, I finally said, "I still don't get it. I know there must be a rational reason, but let's go through this again. How in the world do you expect a woman who says the man is coming to kill her to calmly call you and say, 'Wait a minute, don't shoot me, they're coming'? What does this mean?" And finally a woman says, "Do you understand how many of these calls we get in LA County a year?" And I said, maybe I don't have the exact number in my brain. How many? 600,000 plus. It is the number one reason police are called out in big city and little cities across this town. The number one reason is violence within a household or violence between people who know each other, and it is in 95% of the cases a male endangering or injuring the life of a woman. I think that it is an outrageous, shocking, and horrible statistic. Were you aware of that it's the number one reason that police are called out? How many people are aware of that? There are a handful. I was not. And I thought I was pretty informed on even the subject of violence. This is only a couple years ago. I'd never locked into my brain it was the number one reason. Not drugs, not violence that's random on the street, not robberies or break-ins, and not automobile accidents. I still find it shocking. Another shocking statistic, so some of you I'm sure will know, but most of you will not. The number one reason a woman ages 15 to 45, in that age range, goes to an emergency room is for violence that has bruises and injuries caused by violence towards her from a man. The number one reason. And if you put automobile accidents, muggings, rapes together, the combined number of visits is not as great as the one which is labeled domestic violence, an emergency room. Now, those statistics don't come from the feminist majority. They come from the United States government. In fact, that last one about emergency rooms came from a conservative Surgeon General. That was a coup statistic. Can you imagine what the statistic really is? I mean, think about it. I've learned one thing in organizing on sex discrimination in 22 years of activity in every area of this country that you can think of and in every subject that you can think of. I've been in more negotiating situations and in every industry of this country. And in every single case, whatever we thought was the extent of the problem, when we got the actual statistics and the actual situation investigated by objective people who were not trying to defend the establishment, it was always worse than we thought it was, and what we thought it was bad enough to get us activated in the first place. We demanded in Los Angeles, you all see the Rodney King thing? You know, the beating of the black motorist who was supposedly speeding or whatever. You all saw those videos? When that occurred, the feminist majority entered the case, demanding that they investigate not only police brutality towards minority men, but that they investigate police brutality towards women, both white, black, Latina, and Asian. In other words, that they add sex as well as race and see what they get. And not only that, we wanted them to look at who perpetuated the violence, which police officers, by race and gender. Now, we believed when we asked those questions that the two things would occur. One, that minority police officers would have less cases of violence. Two, the females would have less cases of violence. And three, that women police officers would be more responsive to violence that was perpetuated towards women than men police officers. The reason we entered was not only on the subject of police brutality, but remember, we first were raised to a fever pitch about the Latina woman who was killed and her 3 relatives. When police did not respond, we wanted to know, was police brutality connected to police responsiveness in domestic violence or other cases of violence towards women? We made such a fuss that they indeed connected it and agreed to put that into the study. Now, our hypothesis was, when we started, that what would happen when police officers were called for a domestic violence case, and I hate the word domestic violence, by the way. Domestics don't cause violence, you know what I mean? It's a non sequitur. It's not the domestic, you don't get it, okay? It's male violence towards women, and we should say what we mean. When we thought that when the police were called on a case where a woman was saying that she was being beaten or she needed help, raped, whatever it is, that what the response was going to be was nothing, or lack of response. Remember, I always said when you investigate, it is worse than what you thought. After months of investigation, we found the following facts, which now the commissioner and the police commissioner admit to, and shocking that as it is, they have agreed that there is no argument that we have it cold. It is on the radio transmissions and everything. That when they were called because a woman is in distress, the response over the radio transmissions was as bad as the horrible responses towards black and Asian and Latina men. In other words, you heard in Time magazine, you must have seen, or in other publications, how they made horrible racist comments about minority men, which was always accompanied, or not always, but frequently, with some violence. What wasn't said, and didn't get much press, is the further investigation showed that when a woman called because she was being beaten, the disparaging comments about women were as upsetting, outrageous, and even in many cases worse than what was said on race. I'll give you an example of some of the type of response. A woman calls because she's being beaten. They had a number for a domestic violence case or this type of victim. That number, and it said it's a 395, say. I'm not sure the number, and I'm not reading, but it's essentially what they said, the number, and they said, oh, you know, go on out there this time and stick your baton up her. But sticking the baton up her got me. I'll never forget that one. Another one said, well, that, another expletive word, that derogatory word, you fill it in, blah, blah, about woman, typical derogatory language. This time I'm going out there and slap her senseless myself, so maybe she doesn't bother us again. One of the worst cases was a woman who was elderly, almost 80 years old, was being beaten, and the police went there and helped beat her up. Shocking? I can show you the transcripts. It's from the Christopher Commission. Is there a problem? Is that problem just something that is cultural? Or is that problem because discrimination is tolerated in our society? In police force after police force, the percentage of women as officers is minuscule. In big police forces like Los Angeles, it's around 15% of the officers are women. In small police forces, in rural towns and small towns, it is smaller, much more like 5%. The national average of women police officers is 7%. When a woman calls for help, most likely, who is to come but men who may be themselves beaters? In fact, authoritarian personality study shows that those people most likely to be perpetuators of violence are people in authority and control roles, namely police, lawyers, judges, doctors, ministers. These types of personalities tend to engage or have a worse record than average. That is not to stigmatize all the people in these categories, of course. But if anything, it could be worse than average. When we showed these statistics and made the police of Los Angeles have to look at it, and we're still fighting for integration of the police force. And by the way, we have been in court the National Organization for Women started a lawsuit in Los Angeles in 1971 to integrate the Los Angeles Police Force. We've been in court in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, all over this country to integrate these police forces, and they have drugged their fills, and that force is up to 14%. God knows what it would have been if we hadn't won the damn case. We'd still be at 3%, but 14% does not make equality. And we are demanding gender balance now. We don't want any more gradual folding in. We won a court case in 1980 that they would gradually integrate. We should be up to 20% by 1990, and we're still at 14%. And we're saying, to hell with your gradual. We want 50%, and we want it now. And we want a change in the attitude of the police officers from the top to the bottom about the role of women, the place of women, the position of women, and the respect of women. And we are fighting, fighting, fighting. The deputy police officer, and the reason I'm going into this case is just to take back tonight our audience, but it deals with equality. Fundamentally equality. The deputy police officer who is still there, deputy chief, second in command. You heard a lot about the first in command. The second one's a beauty too. The second in command preaches and believes that a man has a right to use force to exact obedience and discipline, not only on his children, but on his wife. And his religion tells him so. In other words, he thinks it is not only okay, but indeed it is the moral thing to use force against your wife or children to get them to do what you want them to do. And this is the man who is second in command on a police force that gets 600,000 domestic violence calls, 95% of which are men hitting women a year. Now, what does this have to do with equality in Iowa? Everything. I firmly believe that the reason we can debate, the reason that we have to march, the reason that this is a discussion is the low status of women. We have not made a decision in this country, either at the federal level and nor at most of the state levels. We have not made a decision that women are equal, that we deserve equal respect, that our pay and our work should be valued equally with that of men. We have debated ad infinitum the role of women, and in that debate we have limited us. It is always to limit women. Men are the standard of what should be. Women are a part of it. And legitimizing that debate, allowing it to go on and on, gives a message to women and men all over the country that it is okay that women are slapped around. Now you say, well, maybe that's a big leap. How could a law change things? I think that every day that a woman goes to work and looks at a paycheck that is significantly less than her husband, every day she is told that her work is not as important as his. Every day he goes to work and is treated with more respect and higher pay, he is told by his society he is worth more. And so when they both go home at night, he is tired because he has really worked. He has the important job. He did the stressful thing because, after all, society said it was a better job, a more important job. It had to be a harder job because it got paid more. And of course her job wasn't as important. It made a piddly amount by comparison. It was just women's work. And so it was only fair that when she gets home, that the dinner should be on the table, the children should be redded up, everything should be made just nicely nice, because the Lord and Master is home and he has to have things under control so he can be all prepared to go to his important job. Now, this happens obviously in families where people don't work. It's even worse, because then her work as a homemaker is totally devalued. She gets no pay for it. She is the person, indeed, that is the support troop, while he is constantly told what he is doing is to be financially more rewarded. Our employment discrimination laws are on the books at the federal and most state levels, but in all cases, when they do not have a constitutional guarantee, they are of less importance than a constitutional amendment, or, to put it more directly, most of the existing statutes and laws have all kinds of loopholes and exemptions because we have not really decided that sex discrimination is wrong, and that we are going to outlaw it fundamentally in the basic laws of our land that are no longer debatable. We have said we can continue I have a terrible cold, and I'm going to drink a couple minutes. I started this thing with a cold, and it's not getting better. This is about my fifth or sixth speech in just a very short time, and the cold is getting the best of me. Anyway, we have essentially said in our employment and educational discrimination legal network that we are still making up our mind whether and when the society can legally discriminate against women. We are saying it's open for debate, and we're doing more. We are actually debating it in Congress almost every year. The civil rights statutes in the last 8 years, the 10 years, have been gutted and altered by the Supreme Court. And when we hear the word civil rights, many of us think it is dealing with race alone. Those statutes deal with sex, as well as race, and they have one more problem on the sex dimension. Race has a constitutional guarantee for non-discrimination. Sex doesn't. And so when you weaken the statutes that apply to sex discrimination, race and ethnic and religious, for sex, since we do not have a constitutional guarantee, you're giving us no backup, no safety net. In fact, you are literally making the laws unenforceable. A lot of you are wearing I Believe Anita Hill buttons. It was because of her courage to come forth that we were able to save the Civil Rights Act of 1992. The reason we needed that act is because existing statute of 1964 was essentially gutted in a series of cases in 1989 by this very reactionary Supreme Court. What no one has really focused on before, or at least the public hadn't, experts and women's rights activists knew, but I don't think the average woman knew, or the average man, is that under existing statutes, there had been a double standard on sex and race, so that under race, if you prove discrimination adequately, you could get compensatory and punitive damages. Under sex, if you proved it, you could only get back pay. In other words, under race, you could get back pay and damages. Under sex, you could get back pay. One of the difficulties is it's hard to get lawyers to take cases when they speculate and they only get a portion, a percentage of the take if they win, to take a case where there's no damages. And so it was harder and harder, and has been harder and harder for women to get lawyers to take sex discrimination cases. Because of what Anita Hill did, we got into the law a damage criteria for sex for the first time in history. And now, women can get up to 150,000 damages, punitive and compensatory, for sex discrimination that is proven. But, and this is the but, there is no cap on other forms of discrimination. And so what it seems like a gain is really a limitation. And I know one thing. If we had a principle of equality, you would not be able to constantly single out the female part of every package and make it and treat it differently. That's at the federal level. But it happens repeatedly at the state and local levels. In fact, we have in our system of laws legal sex discrimination. In other words, it is not only permissible, it is the standard. And it affects every woman's pocketbook. Where are those legal methods? It's called insurance. It's called pension plans. It's called disabilities insurance. It's called health insurance. It's called life insurance. It's called Social Security. In every case, if you analyze the system, females take out less benefits and pay in proportionately more. In Social Security, our national retirement system, it was never meant to be one. The older people in this room would know that, but that in effect is what it is. Women make about 60% of what men make in Social Security benefits. That's a hell of a cut. That discrimination in pay carries right over in retirement, and you say, well, that makes sense to me. They make less, they should get less. They made less because of discrimination. The system at the end gives them less, and it gives them less even if they never worked. Because a female's benefit as the dependent is also 50% of what the worker gets. Actually, it's less than the 60%. That type of discrimination in our Social Security system, I believe, will never be eradicated until we pass a federal equality amendment. But I am confident that the pension plans, which in effect also discriminate, also will not be corrected until we get state equality amendments. Insurance and annuities and pensions are mostly regulated at the state level, not the federal level. And remember, we do not have state equality amendments in most states. In fact, we only have ERAs, or equal rights amendments, in 12 states of the Union. Insurance is a state-regulated industry, not a federal-regulated industry. And right now, in its pricing schemes and its award benefits, sex is legally an accepted classification system. Period. In education, there's still massive discrimination. It's legal. Scholarship systems all over this country reward men differently than females. On the average, women make about 2/3 of what men make in scholarship awards and in loan programs. And to add insult to the injury, we only make about 60 cents on the dollar in work-study programs. Now, no one comes through and says, hey, you're one of those that get less, so we're going to charge you less tuition. Nobody says, hey, you're a female and this degree isn't going to be worth enough, you know? How can we charge you what we're charging your brother? No way, Jose. You pay the same and you get less. And in a way, it's only right to get young women conditioned to inequality and awful standards from a very young age. So when they get it the rest of their life, they think it's normal. Now, all of these equality inequalities, all these economic inequalities, I think leads and encourages the violent inequalities. Now, I don't think that violence is perpetuated by money alone or the lack of status. It's deeper than that. I am not a fool. But I know one thing. It certainly is augmented by it. And for a woman who is trapped in an awful, intolerable situation, it helps to keep her entrapped because she's afraid she cannot go out there and survive on her income, and she cannot feed the children, and she cannot feed herself. And when she's old and alone, it's even worse. She knows she cannot survive, so she takes it and takes it and takes it. By the way, I hope every person here, when you ever hear a personal case of abuse, that you never let anybody in front of you say, why does she put up with it? Why does she stay? When anybody says that in your presence, I want you to take a stilly look at that person and answer, why does he do it? Why does he do it? The important element of violence is not the reaction of the victim or the survivor of it. The important act is the perpetuator. The important act of our system is not that we have taken equality so long, it's that the dominant class will not help us to change an unjust system, and until this day fight us every inch of the way. Shame on them for fighting us, and God help them, because I firmly believe that the anger they fear is coming. I saw someplace that women aren't angry. Don't kid yourself. It's just not Thelma and Louise. It is deep and it is steely. And it has been conditioned from unjust behavior for too long. Just as blacks have had it with whites in this country, and they have, and do not ever kid yourself. We deserve it. The only way racism will stop is if whites stop behaving that way. And the only way sexism stops is if men stop practicing it. Now, I'm not prepared to wait that long. And I know that one of the ways that people behave themselves is that we pass a law and tell them that they can't do it that way anymore. We have laws for a reason. We say to ourselves, we will not tolerate murder, and we pass laws on murder. We have all kinds of laws that we say, we will not tolerate this, and we pass a law on it. We must pass a law saying we will not tolerate in the state of Iowa inequality towards women. And we will give it our highest priority. We will place it in our Constitution. Now, we know the strike of the pen won't eradicate the inequalities, but we know that we have at least established a standard by which, when there is a case of discrimination, a woman will have greater protection. I want you to open up these flyers. And right in the center and the bottom, there's a square. And I want you to look at Section 1, Article 1 of the Iowa State Constitution. This is what we are proposing. And this is what will be on your ballot in November of 1992. I don't want you to think it's a book. I don't want you to think it's complicated. I want you just to see the principle. This is what we will be adding. We'll be adding the underlining. Right now, there is a clause that says right of persons. And it says, all men are by nature free and equal, etc., as you see it. We are taking the radical step in the year 1992 to adding the words "and women." So, if the clause passes, it will read, all men and women are by nature free and equal, and have certain inalienable rights, among which are those of enjoying and defending life and liberty, acquiring, possessing, and protecting property, and pursuing and attaining